This is a topic that I've been thinking about for quite some time, but given Stardusk's recent video addressing statements made by Total Biscuit, I think it's probably the ideal time to make a video about it. To start off with, I want to relay an anecdote about a somewhat forgotten match of tennis. In the lead up to the 1998 Australian Open, the Williams sisters had been watching some of the male tennis players' training sessions, and they convinced themselves on the basis of what they saw that they'd be able to beat a male player ranked around 200th in the world. And so a vanity match was arranged with Carsten Brasch, a German ranked 203rd at the time. I've added a link in the low bar to an article written by Brasch himself in case you're interested in reading his version of events in full, but I think the title of the piece pretty much says it all: How to Beat Both Williams Sisters in One Afternoon. And he didn't just beat them, he obliterated them in straight sets, one after the other. Serena lost 6-1 and Venus 6-2. Serena Williams may in fact be the greatest female tennis player to have ever lived, but when facing off against a man, she can't even remotely begin to crack the top 200. And that in itself is a fairly generous statement. 1 week later, Brasch's ranking slipped down to 350th during that particular Australian Open. As he comically puts it himself, apparently after the game, Serena and Venus immediately told the press they wanted to challenge a male player again. This time they revised the ranking of the man they wanted to face to 350 in the world. I informed the journalist who told me this that in the next week I was set to lose a lot of ATP points and drop down to 350 in the rankings. I told him that if Venus and Serena waited just 1 week, they could challenge me all over again. Now, I don't think this outcome really surprises anyone. Even the most batshit insane radfem who spends most of their day arguing that gender is a social construct probably doesn't actually want to see tennis, or any other competitive physical sport for that matter, become a mixed gender competition. Deep down, beneath all the postmodern insanity, even they realise the implications that no woman would ever win at Wimbledon again. However, what happens when we cross the threshold from physical ability to mental ability? Anatomically, men are 30% stronger by body mass, but in an esport that abstracts physical ability by means of a low exertion control interface like a keyboard or mouse, those issues of physical sexual dimorphism shouldn't be relevant. It should be a completely level playing field, or at least that's the common assumption. This is Toss Girl. As Total Biscuit put it, the Korean StarCraft League had one female pro gamer who lost to Idra and cried. This is her. To give you some background, she consistently won the South Korean Game TV Female StarCraft League, taking consecutive national titles in 2003, 2004 and 2005. According to Wikipedia, after the disappearance of the female leagues in late 2005, Toss Girl has continued to play in regular tournaments with limited success. Her most prominent victories in recent years were beating Modern 2-0 in the GOM TV Classic, the first win by a female in a KESPA-sanctioned tournament, and in 2009 she was able to beat Max in the MSL preliminary round. Now, it's interesting to note here that she appears to have no official KESPA ranking, and the GOM TV Classic is not listed amongst her accomplishments, which makes me think that when the Wikipedia article says she achieved the first win by a female in a KESPA-sanctioned tournament, it's actually a rather generous way of saying that she won a couple of matches in a tournament rather than actually winning the tournament. Even when women lose in a meritocratic competition of skill, we still have to bend over backwards to pretend like she didn't. That said, I'm only peripherally involved with gaming. If you're a mad esport fanatic and I've got her credentials all wrong here, please let me know in the comments section. So, even though the apparent physiological differences between the genders should be leveled in a virtual environment, the consistently top-ranked female player isn't even remotely competitive when thrown into the arena with men. I suspect it has in large part to do with sample size. Not as many women play StarCraft, assuming that Toss Girl is at the top end of the bell curve. In a female-only tournament of 100 people, she might only be facing 2 or 3 people at her own level of skill. In an open tournament consisting of 1,000 people, she might be facing maybe 20 or 30 people that could beat her. But even accounting for sample size, assuming she is in that top 3 to 5%, I still think you'd expect to see a few more wins than a couple of matches in a GOM TV Classic and a single 2009 MSL preliminary round. This raises the question, as with real-world physical sports, are women less able to compete with men on a mental playing field? And if so, why? Well, there isn't a lot of information on the nature of games like StarCraft. It's such a relatively new activity that people are still basically arguing about whether esport is even a legitimate term to describe the more competitive end of the gaming spectrum. There is, however, another much older form of mental competition which has already undergone much of the same arguments and debates about the gender disparity that modern gaming is going through today. Yes, I am talking about that filthy patriarchal boys' club known as chess. And so I bring your attention to an article on science blogs titled, "Why Are There So Few Female Chess Grandmasters?" I don't think you really need to read the whole article in full. You can probably guess the kind of gynocentric platitudes it's full of, but I just want to address what I think are the key points that we repeatedly hear raised when discussing these topics. 3 years ago, Lawrence Summers, former president of Harvard University, claimed that genetic differences between the sexes led to a different ability of aptitude at the high end. His wildly derided led to his dismissal, but his views are by no means uncommon. In the same year, Paul Irving and Richard Lynn conducted a review of existing studies on sex differences in intelligence and concluded, different proportions of men and women with high IQs may go some way to explaining the greater number of men achieving distinctions of various kinds for which a high IQ is required, such as chess grandmasters, field medalists for mathematics, Nobel Prize winners, and the like. So why are there so few female chess grandmasters? Because fewer women play chess. It's that simple. This overlooked fact accounts for so much of the observable difference that other possible explanations, be they biological, cultural, or environmental, are just fighting for scraps at the table. Yeah, it's somewhat disappointing that a person writing for a site called Science Blogs would basically conclude that there are less women because there are less women. Circular reasoning aside, this argument suffers from the same fault that most arguments attempting to explain gender disparity suffer from. It's a problem of regress. Simply stating that there are less female grandmasters because there are less female chess players gets us no closer to an understanding of why women on aggregate don't take up these rigorous mental activities at the same rate as men. The fact that there are less female players, which despite Yong's claim is hardly an overlooked fact, in no way invalidates or even addresses the other possible explanations, be they biological, cultural, or environmental, as to why fewer women take up chess in the first place. The simplest explanations are generally the best explanations, and despite his sophistry and circular reasoning in this article, I think the simplest explanation is still that men and women have innately different aptitudes and interests. Now, with that said, I think aptitude in this case possibly encompasses factors far broader than simply IQ, as Irwin and Lynn's meta-study on sex differences in intelligence would indicate, although that quite obviously is a prominent factor. Some months after reading that article on Science Blogs, I was watching the Stanford University lectures on behavioral biology by Robert Sapolsky, which I'd highly recommend to anyone interested in understanding the human condition, specifically from an Evo Psych perspective. But he said something in the introductory lecture that just clicked with me. It was one of those aha moments where several parts of a jigsaw you've been working on just seem to magically fall into place. I want to play you that clip now.
Some of the time we are just a plain old off-the-rack animal. The second challenge is going to be circumstances where we appear to be just like everybody else, all the other organisms out there, but we do something very different with the similarity. Let me give you an example here. You have two humans, two individuals who are going through a ritual. They are sitting at a table. They're absolutely silent, they're making no eye contact, and they do nothing more physically taxing than every now and then one of them picks up their hand and moves a little piece of wood on the table. And if these happen to be the right two individuals in the middle of a chess grandmaster tournament, these people are maintaining blood pressure for 6 hours running that you only see in a marathon runner. These people are going through thousands of calories a day doing nothing more than thinking. And this is outrageous because you look at one of these chess grandmasters who's just taken down an opponent and took their queen or whatever, and they will have the exact same physiology as some male baboon on the savannah who's just ripped the stomach open of his worst rival. And we're doing it there just with thought.
Very interesting stuff. Now, I haven't really heard this discussed anywhere else, so I don't know how much study has actually been done on the subject. So this comes with a not insignificant amount of speculation on my part, but I think it's time we started to look at intelligence in terms of physiology. Philosophical dualism is something that Stardust and I have spoken about at length, and I think one of the most interesting points on the subject was when High Lord Biochemist pointed out during a MGTOW talk that certain gut bacteria actually regulate serotonin levels. It's not that you can't just divide the mind from the body. You can't even divide the body and the mind from other sub-organisms like gut microbia. We have a tendency to abstract the mental from the physical and assume that one should not necessarily affect the other, but there is a very real possibility that the physical differences in strength, stamina, and agility between the sexes could have some real implications on the exercise of long-term strenuous mental activity. Putting a man and a woman in a calm, controlled test environment where they spend 20 minutes completing a standardized IQ test is one thing, but if two players in a chess grandmasters tournament are displaying the same real-time physiology as an athlete running a marathon, then just because the man and the woman consistently score the same IQ on paper does not mean they're necessarily going to be competitive equals when they try to express that IQ in a situation of extreme mental exertion and duress over several hours. A StarCraft or Dota tournament, a chess grandmasters match, or perhaps a job 8 hours a day, 5 days a week doing complex physics calculations at an engineering firm. Despite the popular idea of mental activities being somehow abstracted from the real world, these activities actually place real physical stress on the body, and men and women do have very different bodies, whether they're on the court or at a LAN party. It's something to think about at least.